Hey everyone! Today we're going to dive into something pretty fundamental to how experts think about the law. It really all boils down to this super powerful but simple distinction. Looking at what the law is versus what the law should be. Let's jump right in.
So let's kick things off with a question I bet you've wondered about at some point. You see a parking ticket on a windshield and think, why is it 50 bucks? And is that even the right amount? I mean, is it too high? Maybe it's not high enough. Now, it sounds like one simple question, right? But as you're about to see, it's actually two completely different questions rolled into one.
So to really unpack that, we've got to look at the law from a couple of different angles.
Yeah, to get to the bottom of that $50 fine, we absolutely have to pull apart the why is it this way from the should it be this way. And to do that, we need two different tools in our toolkit. Think of it like this. One tool is for just observing reality as it is, and the other is for, evaluating it.
Okay, so let's grab that first tool. I want you to think of this as putting on your detective hat. Seriously, your only job here is to look at the facts, figure out the cause and effect, and try to predict what's going to happen next. And the key thing? No judgment. None at all.
This approach has a name, of course. We call it positive economic analysis. It is all about objective facts. It's focused on one question. What are the actual effects of a legal rule? It doesn't care if a rule is good or bad. It just wants to explain what is and predict the consequences.
So let's bring it back to that parking ticket. A positive analysis isn't going to waste time asking if a $50 fine is fair. Nope. Instead, it's going to make a prediction. Something like, okay, if the fine is 50 bucks, we can probably expect illegal parking to drop by, let's say, 20%. See, it's all about the incentives and how they play out in the real world.
So the big goals here really are just to explain, predict, and understand. Why do we even have these rules in the first place? If we change a law, how are people actually going to react? It's all about digging in and finding the economic logic that's already humming away inside our legal system.
All right, detective hat comes off, and now we're picking up the judge's gavel. We're making a big switch here, from what is to what should be. This is where we step in and actually make a judgment call about what the best law would even look like.
And you guessed it, this has a name too. Normative economic analysis. This one is all about evaluation. It's not just describing the world as it is, it's about prescribing how we could make it better, based on some social goal. It asks that huge question, what's the absolute best, most desirable rule we could have for society?
So, circling back to our trusty parking ticket example, the normative analysis asks a totally different question. It asks, is 50 bucks the best price? Is that the sweet spot? Does it perfectly balance the city's need for open parking spaces with the cost and, the annoyance it puts on drivers? It's all about finding the optimal solution.
Okay, so how in the world do we decide what's best? That's a huge question. Well, in the world of law and economics, the go-to standard, the main yardstick we use for this kind of normative analysis, is something called economic efficiency. We're looking for the rule that creates the most overall value for society. Now, there are a couple ways to think about efficiency. The first one is called Pareto efficiency. And let me tell you, this is a really strict standard. A situation is Pareto efficient only if there is no way, absolutely no way, to make one person better off without making somebody else worse off. It's a nice idea for sure, but in the real world, it's tough to achieve. Most policy changes have winners and losers, right?
And that's exactly why policymakers often turn to a more practical concept called Kaldor-Hicks efficiency. The main idea here is pretty simple. A change is efficient if the people who benefit, the winners, gain so much that they could, in theory, pay off the losers and still have something left over. This is really the logic that powers most cost-benefit analysis you hear about.
So, there we have it. We've got our detective, that's the positive analysis, and we've got our judge, the normative analysis. Now let's see how these two tools, which really are two sides of the same coin, work together when we look at some major areas of the law. And this right here really puts it all side by side. It's the key takeaway. Positive analysis, it's descriptive. It asks, what is? Normative analysis, that's prescriptive. It asks, what ought to be? One predicts effects, objectively. The other recommends rules, evaluatively. It's like I said, two sides of one very powerful coin.
Okay, first up, let's take a look at a real-world example. Tort law. This is the area of law that deals with accidents and liability. Basically, who pays when something goes wrong.
So, from the positive side, you'd study how the current liability rules actually change people's behavior. Do they make people drive more carefully or less? But the normative side asks a totally different question. It asks, what's the perfect set of rules that would minimize the total costs of accidents? And that includes both the cost of the accidents themselves and the cost of trying to prevent them.
All right, next example, contract law. This is the whole shebang when it comes to the rules that govern the agreements and promises we make to each other. So a positive analysis might look at how having enforceable contracts actually helps our economy run smoothly, right? It makes trade more predictable. The normative analysis, on the other hand, is trying to be an architect. It wants to design the perfect set of contract rules, the ones that would cut down on transaction costs and make it super easy and cheap for people to make good deals.
And for our last example, let's talk about property law. This is fundamental stuff. It defines who owns what and what rights come with that ownership.
From a positive view, you'd explain how having secure property rights gives people the incentive to invest in and take care of their stuff. It just makes sense. The normative view, though, is aiming higher. It asks, what is the absolute best way we could structure property rights to make sure all our resources, from land to intellectual property, are used in the most efficient and productive way for everyone?
So after all that, you might be thinking, why bother separating these two things so carefully? Well, here's the bottom line. Understanding this distinction is absolutely 100% critical if you want to create smart, effective laws.
Because this is where you really see how they work together. You absolutely cannot make good policy without using both lenses. The positive analysis, the detective, tells you what's actually going to happen if you pass a law, including all the unintended consequences you didn't see coming. Then, the normative analysis, the judge, gives you the goal you're aiming for, like efficiency. You need the detective's facts to inform the judge's decision, and when you put them together, you've got an incredibly powerful toolkit for making better legal policy.
And that leaves us with one last, really challenging question to chew on. What happens when our detective and our judge disagree? What if a positive analysis shows a law is, working, but a normative analysis shows it's super inefficient? What's the right call then? That tension, right there, is at the very heart of the challenge of making good law. Thanks for tuning in.